Hello. Today I am simply going to show you some of the most basic steps for how to make bread. We get quite a few requests for recipes for the bread. However, rather than give you a recipe that may or may not work where you are, or you may not have the ingredients for, I'm simply going to show you the steps, because I do believe that most of the recipes out there are pretty much basically the same in a lot of regards. So what we're going to do is show you more of the method than anything else. So in the bowl I have my eggs, the fat. The fat can be anything you want. Some people say use melted butter. We happen to use canola oil. Some people use coconut oil. You don't have to use eggs. If you want to use egg replacer, you can use egg replacer. The lemon juice is kind of key, although some people, rather than lemon juice, use citric acid crystals. As I said, rather than give you the recipe, I'm going to give you the method. So there's a lot of my wet ingredients. In my bowl, I already have pre-measured my flour, the extra xanthan gum, salt, baking powder, and then whatever option for the bread I'm going to use. We are using sunflower seeds. As you can see, they're whole sunflower seeds, whole pumpkin seeds, flax seeds, and millet, whole millet. We make sure that everything is already measured out so that when the time comes to put it into the bowl in your mixer, you can just put it straight in and get it started. In my measuring cup, I don't know if you can, there, now you can see I've got two of them. In my measuring cup, I have warm water and yeast. As I said, because the recipes are so very different. Some recipes call for hot water to be added to the ingredients as they're mixing. Use put the dry yeast in with the dry ingredients. As I said, because I don't do that, I'm not going to show you that step. You know in your recipe, if you can read the recipe, how it's supposed to go. So as I said, I'm showing you method. I proof my yeast personally because then I can guarantee that it is actually going to proof and grow. Sometimes you can kill your yeast with hot water, as many bakers have proven over the years. So I proof my yeast with warm water so that I know that it grows and isn't going to die on me. As you can see now, my egg mixture, which had the fat and the canola, the lemon juice in it, is now nice and fluffy. It's not stiff because it wouldn't be, seeing as we've got some oil in there. Now, what we prefer to use for sugar is honey. Now, if you are making bread that needs to be sugar-free, omit the sweetener. It is possible to use just about any sweetener. You could use molasses here. It would give you a lovely dark bread. You could use maple syrup. You could use agave syrup. You could use plain white sugar if that's all you've got in your cupboard. Bread is a precise science However, the lovely bit is that the ingredients, if they do the same job, can be swapped in and out. Now that our sweetener, in my case honey, has been lovingly whisked in there, now it's all mixed up, we're going to add the yeast. As you can see now, the yeast is proofed and it's ready to go. So once my yeast is ready, the rest of my wet ingredients should be ready. Now that my yeast is in the bowl, I'm now ready to put my dry ingredients in. If it sticks in the bottom, just tap it or scrape it out. As with anything in baking, it is very important to be as precise as possible, or you will not get a good result every time. So, now the bowls have both wet and dry ingredients in them. I'm going to just simply attach my dough hook. Now, some recipes say don't use the dough hook for gluten-free, always use the paddle. Well, I have found that using the paddle tends to overheat my machine, so I use the dough hooks. However, when starting a recipe for the first time, always do exactly what the recipe says from start to finish. That way you can gauge if there's anything that needs to be changed, or if the recipe is perfect on its own for your area. As you can see now, the mixers are simply just doing their job. I do this on a low speed so that I have some control over what happens. In a moment, I'm going to scrape down the bowls and then just let the mixers go until all the lumps of dough are out. So there's no more flour lumps. With seedy breads, you're going to end up with lumps that you can't smooth out. So remember, those are lumps you can't smooth out. While you wait for your mixers to finish mixing, take time to prepare your pans. Now, our recipe makes 2 loaves of bread every time. So for 2 mixers worth of bread, I need 4 pans. So I've just lightly sprayed these with canola oil. That way, my bread will not stick and I get a lovely crust. As you can see, the mixers are now complete and the bread is ready to go into the pans. And yes, it looks goopy and more like cake batter, and what I find is that if it's any drier than that, you end up with a loaf of bread that you can only really eat the first day or 2 that you've had it made, because it falls apart so very easily. What we've found is that batter that's just a little bit wetter stands up better after it's been baked because it has the moisture content. Our bread typically does not need toasting. You can just make a sandwich if you want one. If you want toast, you make toast. So now the bread dough is now ready for the pans. Now, as you can see, I've smoothed one out. The rest of the dough is in the pans, ready to be leveled. This is a really important step. Take the time to level out your bread. Also, though, be aware that you can spend too much time leveling your bread. You'll learn with experience when you're done and when you need to take just that extra minute or two to finish. Remember not to use your hand, or to try and use your hand when you're smoothing out the tops of your bread. You'll end up with a very nasty surprise if you do. What we do, we happen to have a spoon spatula. And I'll tell you, I love these things. I haven't broken any yet. I've cut the side off of one of them, but never broken them. They are excellent for smoothing, but any spatula will do. If you want to get really picky and very precise, you can use an offset spatula like you would for cake decorating. But we find that a spoon spatula is the best. Now, you may or may not have a special proofing rack like I do for your bread, but now the time has come to simply wait until it rises. If you don't have the fancy baking rack or proofing rack, simply preheat your oven, put your bread on the back of your stove near the vent where the heat comes out, put a towel over it. Before we got the proofing rack, I used to use a piece of saran, loose saran, sprayed with a bit of cooking spray or daubed with a bit of oil over top of the pan with a tea towel over that. The heat does not melt the saran wrap, but it does trap the heat. If you do it that way, you'll find that your bread will proof very quickly. I'm not talking within seconds, I'm talking about half the time this will take. A regular tea towel, though, will give you a lovely indentation on the top, and if you're not careful, when you pick up the tea towel, you will pick up most of the bread. So however you have to proof your bread, do that. I don't recommend doing like a regular wheat bread where you might turn the oven on and then turn it off and leave the light on so you've got a nice enclosed draft-free place, simply because once this is proofed, you're going to put it right in the oven. And I've not had good results doing that and then turning the oven on. You end up with either very burnt and raw bread. You end up with bread that does not proof properly. Little bricks have resulted from that method as well. So find a place that you're comfortable with leaving your bread and let it proof. While you're waiting for your bread to proof, now is the perfect time to do the dishes. Or if you're like me, as you can see, I have more bread to make. So now, because my oven is larger than yours probably is, I am going to get started on the next 2 batches of bread while I wait for the first 4 to proof. Here you can see the bread is clearly starting to rise. It's not quite high enough to be put in the oven yet, but it's getting there. The question has been asked, why use honey or sugar at all? The reason why you use honey or sugar in your bread is twofold. One, you use it so that your yeast has something to eat while it bubbles and works and rises your bread. The other reason why you use honey or sugar or molasses or agave syrup or maple syrup is for texture. You will find that bread made with granulated sugar has a totally different texture than bread made with honey or molasses. You will also find that bread made with maple syrup, as the sugar for your yeast to work, will simulate using regular sugar for the texture. Not the flavor, but the texture. You'll also find that with agave syrup and many thin syrups. The question has been asked, why use honey or sugar at all? The reason why you use honey or sugar in your bread is twofold. One, you use it so that your yeast has something to eat while it bubbles and works and rises your bread. The other reason why you use honey or sugar or molasses or agave syrup or maple syrup is for texture. You will find that bread made with granulated sugar has a totally different texture than bread made with honey or molasses. You will also find that bread made with maple syrup, as the sugar for your yeast to work, will simulate using regular sugar for the texture. Not the flavor, but the texture. You'll also find that with agave syrup and many thin syrups. The question has been asked, why use honey or sugar at all? The reason why you use honey or sugar in your bread is twofold. One, you use it so that your yeast has something to eat while it bubbles and works and rises your bread. The other reason why you use honey or sugar or molasses or agave syrup or maple syrup is for texture. You will find that bread made with granulated sugar has a totally different texture than bread made with honey or molasses. You will also find that bread made with maple syrup, as the sugar for your yeast to work, will simulate using regular sugar for the texture. Not the flavor, but the texture. You'll also find that with agave syrup and many thin syrups. As you can see, while in the oven, our bread has continued to rise. Quite beautifully, actually. Let me just open this up carefully. You don't do this normally. There. It's not a good idea to open and close your oven. It changes the temperature and causes a sudden dip and then rise in temperature, and it does nasty things to baked goods. But I wanted you to see what they looked like. The other problem with overproofing is that your bread will collapse. So try to avoid overproofing as much as possible. As you can see, my next set of 4 loaves are rising quite nicely. Not quite ready, but they're getting there. As you can see, now it's time to do the dishes. Things are just about done with the bread. Next, we're going to show you how to make a vegan date square. It's a very, very simple recipe. It has been around for many, many years. Most people know it as matrimonial cake. The beauty of the recipe we're going to show you, and I will give you the actual recipe, is that it can be made with almost any filling, as long as the filling isn't really wet. My favorite is mincemeat, but you can make it easily with an apple pie filling, cherry filling, apricot filling, plum filling. We've even made it with a chocolate mousse on the inside, so there are innumerable possibilities with this particular recipe we're going to show you. And as you can see, there's our bread. The timer has gone. Got a nice full loaf of bread. Got a lovely crust on it the whole way around. You're not just going to end up with a crust that's lovely on the top and white on the bottom. So there you have it. Simple, gluten-free bread 101. Now, the true trick with gluten-free bread is to not slice it right away. I know it's tempting to cut into that and slather some butter or something on it that's just going to melt beautifully and dig your teeth into it. But what you'll end up doing is tearing your loaf of bread very badly and possibly collapsing the whole thing. So truly, unfortunately, the trick with gluten-free bread is to let it cool. You can even get it to where it's cool to the touch and then slice into it. But really, don't slice into it when it's warm. You will not be happy with the results, especially if your bread has turned out as nicely. Happy baking, and don't be afraid to try.